The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. In preparation for violence. The 12-month cycle was ended. Titus had begun his second year, a year which, though hardly fledged, was soon to bring forth violence. There was a sickness in the atmosphere. Of all this suspicion and restlessness he knew nothing, and he will have no memories of these days. Yet the aftermath of all that was happening in his infancy will soon be upon him. Mrs. Slagg watched him querulously as he tottered in his efforts to keep balance, for Titus had almost learned to walk. "Why won't he smile?" she whimpered. "Why won't his little lordship ever smile?" The sound of Barquentine's crutch echoed down the hollow corridors. His withered leg padded beside it, and the red sacking flapped its tatters in hot gusts. His edicts went forth like oaths. Drear ritual turned its wheel. The ferment of the heart within these walls was mocked by every length of sleeping shadow. The passions, no greater than candle flames, flickered in time's yawn. For Gormenghast, huge and adumbrate, out crumbles all. The summer was heavy with a kind of soft grey-blue weight in the sky, yet not in the sky, for it was as though there were no sky, but only air, an impalpable grey-blue substance drugged with the weight of its own heat and hue. The sun, however brilliantly the earth reflected it from stone or field or water, was never more than a rayless disk this summer. In the thick, hot air, a sick circle, unrefreshing and aloof. The autumn and winter winds and the lashing rainstorms and the very cold of those seasons, for all their barbarism, were of a spleen that voiced the heart. Their passions were allied to human passions, their cries to human cries. But it was otherwise with this slow pulp of summer, this drag of heat, with the incurious yellow eye within it, floating monotonously, day after day. At the river's edge, the shallow water stank, and mists of insects drifted over the scum, spinning their cry of far-forgotten worlds, thinner than needles. Toads in the green ooze belched. In the river's bosom, the reflection of the topmost crags of Gormenghast Mountain hung like stalactites, and in the scarcely perceptible motion of the water appeared to crumble momently, yet never to diminish or to disintegrate for all their crumbling. Across the river, a long field of sparse grey-green grasses and dove-grey dust lay stretched as though stunned between its low flint walls. Little clouds of the fine dust were rising at the very footfall of a small mottled horse, on whose back sat a man in a cape. At every fifth step forward of his mount's left leg, the rider stood up in his stirrups and placed his head between the horse's ears. The river wound beside them, the fields undulating and fading in a blur of heat. The mottled horse and the caped rider moved on. They were very small. In the haze to the extreme north, the tower of flints arose like a celluloid ruler set floating upon its end, or like a watercolour drawing of a tower that had been left in the open and whose pigment had been all but washed away by a flirt of rain. Distance was everywhere, a sense of far away, of detachment. What might have been touched with an outstretched arm was equally removed, withdrawn in the grey-blue polliniferous body of the air, while overhead the inhuman circle swam. Summer was on the roofs of Gormenghast. It lay inert, like a sick thing. Its limbs spread. It took the shape of what it smothered. The masonry sweated and was horribly silent. The chestnuts whitened with dust and hung their myriads of great hands with every wrist broken. What was left in the water in the moat was like soup. A rat floundered across it, part swimming, part walking. Thick sepia patches of water were left in the unhealthy scum, where its legs had broken through the green surface. The quadrangles were soft with dust. It had settled along the branches of the nearby trees. Footmarks were left deeply until the gusts came again. The varying lengths of stride, the doctors, fuchsias, the countesses, swelters, could all be measured here, crossing and recrossing one another as though at the same time, yet hours, days, and weeks divided them. In the evening the bats, those fabulous winged mice, veered, tacked, and slid through the hot gloom. Titus was growing older. It was 4 days since the dark breakfast. It was 1 year and 4 days since he was born in the room of wax and birdseed. The Countess would see no one. From daybreak to sunset she turned her thoughts like boulders over. She set them in long lines. She rearranged their order as she cogitated upon the burning. She watched from her window as figures passed below. She turned her impressions over heavily. She was pondering all who passed by. From time to time Steerpike passed as she sat at her window. Her husband was going mad. She had never loved him, and she did not love him now, her heart being awakened to tenderness only by her birds and her white cats. But though she did not love him for himself, her unthinking and rooted respect for the heritage which he personified, and her dumb pride in the line of his descent, had filled her since her discovery of his illness. Flay had gone, at her orders, to what lay beyond the great walls. He had gone, and though she would no more have thought of recalling him than of ceasing to tend the cat which he had bruised, yet she was aware of having uprooted a part of Gormenghast, as though from an accustomed skyline of towers one had been broken down. He had gone, but not altogether. Not for a little while completely. On the 5 nights following the day of his banishment, Titus's first birthday, he had returned unobserved when light had fallen. He had moved like a stick insect through the grey star-pricked summer night, and knowing every bay, inlet, and headland of the great stone islands of the Groans, of its sheer cliffs, of its crumbling outcrops, he had pursued his way without hesitation on a zigzag course. He had only to lean against the cliff face and he was absorbed. For the 5 last nights he had come, after long sultry days of waiting among the skirting trees of the twisted woods, through a gap in the castle walls to the western wing. In his banishment he had felt the isolation of a severed hand, which realizes that it is no more part of the arm and body it was formed to serve, and where the heart still beats. As yet, for him, the horror of his ostracization was too close for him to grasp. Only the crater-like emptiness. The stinging nettles had not had time to fill the yawning hollow. It was loneliness without pain. His loyalty to the castle, too deep for him to question, was his heart's background, to all that was implied by the broken line of the towers. With his knees drawn up to his chin, he pored upon that skyline as he sat at the base of an outcrop of rock among the trees. At his side lay the long sword he had sharpened. The sun was going down. In another 3 hours he would be on his way, for the 6th time since his banishment, to the cloisters he had known since his youth. To the cloisters in whose northern shadows was an entrance to the stairhead of the wine vaults and the kitchens. 1,000 recollections attached themselves to these cloisters alone. Sudden happenings, the awakening of ideas that had borne fruit or had withered at his touch, the memories of his youth, of his infancy even, for a brightly coloured vignette to the back of his dark skull recurred from time to time. a vignette of crimson, gold, and grey. He had no recollection of who it was who led him by the hand, but he recalled how, between two of the southerly arches, he and his guardian were stopped, how the air had filled with sunshine, how a giant, for so he must have then appeared to the child, a giant in gold, had given him an apple, the globe of crimson which he had never released from his mind's empiric grasp, nor the grey of the long hair that fell across the brow and over the shoulders of his first memory. Few of Flay's memories were as colourful. His early years had been hard, grinding, and monotonous. His recollections were associated with fears and troubles and hardships. He could remember how beneath the very cloister arches to which he was soon to make his way, he had received in grim silence, insult, and even violence no less than twinges of pleasure. He had leaned there against the fourth pillar on the afternoon following his unexpected summons to Lord Sepulchre's study, where he had been told of his advancement, of his being chosen as the Earl's first servant, of how the Earl had noticed and approved of his silent and taciturn bearing, and of his reward. He had leaned there, his heart thumping, and he recalled how he had for a moment weakened, wishing he had a friend to whom he might speak of his happiness. But that was long ago. Clicking his tongue, he dismissed recollections from his mind. A gibbous moon was rising, and the earth and the trees about him were dappled and striped with slowly shifting blotches of black and pearlish white. Radiance in the shape of an oyster moved across his head. He turned his eyes to the moon among the trees and scowled at it. This was no night for a moon. He cursed it, but in a childlike way, for all the grim formation of his bones, stretching out his legs, on whose knees his chin had been supported. He moved his thumb across the edge of his sword, and then unrolled a misshapen parcel at his side. He had not forgotten to bring some food with him from the castle, and now, 5 nights later, he made a meal upon all that was left out of it. The bread had gone dry, but it tasted sweet to him after a day's abstinence, with the cheese and the wild blackberries he had gathered in the woods. He left nothing but a few crumbs on his black trousers. There was no rational reason why he should feel, as he finished the berries, that horror lay between his last mouthful and his next meal, whenever it might be, and however he might acquire it. Perhaps it was the moon. On his 5 previous nocturnal journeys to the castle there had been no light. Thick, rainless clouds had provided a perfect cover. Schooled to adversity, he took it as a sign that the hour was approaching. Indeed, it seemed more natural that nature should be his enemy. He rose slowly, and from beneath a heap of ferns he drew forth into the moonlight great lengths of cloth, and then began a most peculiar operation. Squatting down, he began, with the concentration of a child, to bind the cloth about his knees, around and around endlessly, until they were swathed to a depth of 5 thick inches, loosely at the joint, and more tightly as they wound below and above it, and as the binding thickened. This business took him the best part of an hour, for he was very scrupulous, and had several times to unwind long swathes to adjust and ease the genuflections of his knees. Finally, however, all was ready, and he got to his feet. He took a step forward, then another, and it seemed as though he was listening for something. Was there no sound? He took 3 more paces, his head lowered and the muscles behind his ears working. What was that he heard? It was like a muffled clock that ticked 3 times and stopped. It sounded very far away. There were a few lengths of cloth left over, and he bound his knees to another 1/2 inch of thickness. When he next stepped forward, the silence was absolute. it was still possible for him to move with comparative freedom. His legs were so long that he had become accustomed to use them as stilts, and it was only with the slightest bending of the knee that they were wont to detonate. The moonlight lay in a gauze-like sheet of whiteness over the roof of the Twisted Woods. The air was hot and thick, and the hour was late when he began to move towards the castle. To reach the cloisters would take him an hour of rapid walking. The long sword gleamed in his hand. At the corners of his lipless mouth was the red stain of blackberries. The trees were left behind, and the long slopes where the juniper bushes crouched like animals or deformed figures in the darkness. He had skirted the river and had found a clammy mist lying like a lover along its length, taking its curves and hugging its croaking body, for the bullfrogs had made the night air loud. The moon behind the miasmic wreaths swam and bulged as though in a contorting mirror. The air was sickly with the aftermath of the day's heat, as lifeless as though it had been breathed before, thrice exhaled, and stale. Only his feet felt cold as they sank ankle-deep in the dew. It was as though he trod through his own sweat. With every step he became more conscious that he was narrowing the distance between himself and something horrible. With every step the cloisters leapt forward to meet him, and his heart pounded. The skin was puckered between his eyes. He strode on. The outer wall of the castle was above him. It mouldered in the moon. Where colonies of lizards clung to its flaking surfaces, it shone. He passed through an arch. The unchecked growth of ivy which hung about it had almost met at the centre of the aperture, and Flay, bending his head, forced his way through a mere fissure. Once through, and the grounds of Gormenghast opened balefully out with an alien intimacy, as though an accustomed face should, after confining itself for years to a score of cardinal expressions, take on an aspect never known before. Keeping as much to the shadows as he could, Flay made rapid progress over the uneven ground towards the servants' wing. He was treading on forbidden ground. Excommunicated by the Countess, each footfall was a crime committed. During the final stages of his progress to the cloisters, he moved with a kind of angular stealth. At times he would come to a halt and genuflect in rapid succession, but he could hear no sound. Then he would move on again, the sword in his hand. And then, suddenly, before he realized it, he was in the servants' quadrangle and skirting the wall to the cloisters. Within a minute, and he was part of the charcoaled shadow of the third pillar, where he had waited so patiently for the last 5 moonless nights.